The gin trolley arrived in the breakfast room at Clarence House every morning at approximately 10 minutes to 11, wheeled in by the under-butler, set down beside the window that looked out over the mall. The trolley carried a bottle of Gordon's, a bottle of Dubonnet, 2 cut-glass tumblers, a small jug of ice. By 10 past 11, the Queen Mother, who had risen at 9, breakfasted at 1/2 past, opened her correspondence at 10, would be on her first drink of the day. The second came at 12:30, before lunch. The third came with lunch. The fourth came at 6. The port came after dinner. The household routine was the same on every day of every year between her widowhood in February 1952 and her death in March 2002. 50 years. The Churchill line, surfaced by an audience comment, not by any of the official biographers, was that if the Queen Mother ever went for a water test, a gin bottle might come out instead. Some of that sequence the public has heard before in fragments. Some of it has never been set down in a single document, in order, with the named witnesses attached. That is what the next 30 minutes are for. The primary witness to the daily intake is Major Colin Burgess. He served as equerry to the Queen Mother for 2 years, between 1994 and 1996, having been commissioned into the Irish Guards in 1987. He stayed on as a close friend until her death. His memoir, Behind Palace Doors, was published by John Blake in 2006, co-written with Paul Carter. It is the most detailed published inventory of what the household poured and when. Burgess records the first drink of the day at noon, not in his own text, at 10 minutes to 11. The hour that has come down through the lifestyle press, through Adrian Tinniswood's 2018 domestic history of the royal household, through the Guardian's accounting in the early 2000s, is noon. The trolley, as the audience imagines it, is real. The chronology in the popular telling has crept earlier than the documented record supports. What Burgess set down was a midday gin and Dubonnet, 2 parts Dubonnet to 1 part gin, lemon or orange, depending on the fruit on the sideboard, mixed, in his telling, by him. The second drink came at lunch, red wine, heavy clarets favored, then sometimes port after. The third sequence Burgess documented was the one she named. At 6 in the evening, she would say, in words he reproduces verbatim, "Colin, are we at the magic hour?" And he would mix the martini, sometimes 1, sometimes 2. After the magic hour came dinner, and dinner came with 1 or 2 glasses of pink champagne, which the household ordered from Veuve Clicquot, of which the Queen Mother was the largest private client. That is the architecture. Noon, lunch, 6, dinner. Gin, wine, martini, champagne, sometimes port. The intake, totaled by Amin Sanner in The Guardian, came to approximately 70 units of alcohol a week, 10 times the threshold by which a contemporary American clinical text would classify a woman as a heavy drinker, twice the threshold in Britain. Burgess himself, the man who poured, characterized it as steady rather than excessive. His own line on the subject is that she was nowhere near being an alcoholic. Both things, the 70 units and the equerry's professional defense of his employer, are in the record. The script will not adjudicate between them. The inventory is the inventory. Now, the figure who has not entered yet, the figure the audience comment placed at the door of this video. Winston Churchill. Churchill was not, in fact, a gin drinker. The Churchill myth, the dry martini stared at across the room, the formidable consumption of cocktails, is largely apocryphal, documented as such by the International Churchill Society and by drinks historians who have catalogued which of his quotations are real and which are post-war invention. Churchill drank scotch, heavily watered scotch, what his daughter called the Papa Highball, what his secretary Jock Colville described as Scotch-flavored mouthwash. Churchill avoided cocktails. He did not, by any sourced account, make jokes about gin bottles emerging from water tests. The line that floats through the comment threads under this channel's videos, that if the Queen Mother ever went for a water test, a gin bottle might come out, is not in the Churchill canon. It is not in Beaverbrook's diaries, in the form that has been searched. It is not in Philip Larkin's letters. It surfaces in 2026 under a video on YouTube with 58 likes. It circulates in the kind of place jokes about the Queen Mother have always circulated, at country lunches, at officers' messes, at the third gin of a London evening. The line may be older than the comment that carried it. It almost certainly is. But the documented chain back to Churchill is not there. What is in the canon, what the audience has not yet had handed to it, is a different quote, in the Queen Mother's own hand. In July of 2008, Sotheby's auctioned the personal collection of the man who had served as the Queen Mother's page, then steward, then page of the back stairs, for 51 years. His name was William Tallon. The household called him Backstairs Billy. He had died in November of 2007, the year before the auction. Among his preserved effects was a handwritten note from his employer, undated but unmistakably hers in the slope and the sentence rhythm. It read, "I think that I will take 2 small bottles of Dubonnet and gin with me this morning, in case it is needed." The note fetched £16,000 against a much lower estimate. 400 people followed the bidding from the auction room. Another 1,000 bid by phone and over the internet. It is the only known document in the Queen Mother's own hand that specifies the drink. It was not written by a biographer. It was written by her to her page about a morning's supply. That is the receipt evidence the Churchill line does not have. The Churchill quote belongs to the audience. The Sotheby's note belongs to the record. Now, the institutional question the brief has been quietly asking from the beginning. What was the cost? The Queen Mother's civil list annuity, after the increase of 1990, was £643,000 a year. That figure is in the statutory instrument that raised it. Civil List Increase of Financial Provision Order 1990, number 2018, on the Legislation Register. It had been £334,400 before the increase, which is to say that the annuity nearly doubled in a single statutory instrument signed in a year in which the country was emerging from recession and in which the larger civil list for the monarch herself was already a matter of parliamentary debate. $643,000 was the published figure. It covered, in aggregate, her household of approximately 70 staff, the maintenance of the Clarence House interiors, official entertainment, and personal expenditure. It did not, in any published Royal Trustees report reviewed for this script, break out a separate consumables line for the cellar. The cellar was inside the aggregate. The cellar was not a public line item. The household actually cost, by reputable estimate, between £1 and £2 million a year. The gap, the difference between what the civil list paid and what the household spent, was bridged by the privy purse, the income from the Duchy of Lancaster, by personal transfers from her elder daughter Elizabeth, and, ultimately, by the overdraft at Coutts and Company, the private bank that had served the British royal family since 1801. Brief 2 of this series, which the audience has now seen and which sits in the channel's recent uploads, established the figure at Coutts at her death in March 2002. Approximately £4 million in arrears. Some sources push the figure to 7. The bank has not, on the record, confirmed either number. Both are in circulation. What is in circulation also is the larger context. The Queen Mother's estate at death. Art, Fabergé eggs, jewelry, racehorses, the contents of Royal Lodge and Burke Hall, and the house in Caithness was valued at between £50 and £70 million. Approximately $19 million had been placed into trust for great-grandchildren some 8 years before her death, which removed it from the taxable estate. The 4 million overdraft in that context was the small balance left at the till at the end of a half-century of unmetered cellar use. It was the residue. The estate covered it. The bank wrote it off in the way private banks write off the balances of clients whose families pay in the next generation. Coutts has not, on the record, said otherwise. The Queen Mother's daughter, in private with her household, was known to say when the bills came in, "Oh, Mummy, grow up." The line is in Ben Pimlott's biography of the Queen, published by HarperCollins in 1996. Pimlott framed the saying as humor. There was humor, he wrote, in the way the two women related. The frustration was real, but the affection was real also, and there was no one in the country in a position to refuse the bills. The daughter, in this telling, had inherited a parent the way a corporate inheritor receives a profitable subsidiary with a long-standing executive habit of expensive lunches. The lunches were institutional. The lunches were expected. The lunches were what the office required. The bills were paid, the biographers in order. There are 3 voices the script has been waiting to introduce in sequence, and they belong here, because each represents a different register on the same factual material. Hugo Vickers published his Elizabeth the Queen Mother in 2005 with Hutchinson. He had been given partial access to letters. His register on the drinking is guarded. The routine is mentioned, but it is not centered, and it is not catalogued. Vickers is writing within the institution, and the institution does not, by its lights, advertise the daily intake of a woman who has just died at 101. William Shawcross published his official biography in 2009 with Macmillan and ran to 1,096 pages. He had unrestricted access to the Royal Archives. The register is the official register. The routine is acknowledged in passing. It is not, in Shawcross, the subject. The subject, in the official register, is duty, war, family, longevity. Shawcross is candid on her hardness in some interpersonal scenes. He is protective on the lifestyle. Lady Colin Campbell published her Untold Story of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in 2012, with Dynasty Press. She had no institutional access. She wrote a different book. Her central thesis on parentage was attacked by Hugo Vickers and Michael Thornton in the press at publication as bizarre and as complete nonsense. The timing of her publication, on the 10th anniversary of the Queen Mother's death, was condemned. Her register on the drinking is blunt. She wrote of the wartime years that the Queen Mother had formed a drinking club and that she had raided the wine cellars of her palaces and castles and floated on a sea of booze, never entirely sober, but never actually drunk either. 3 writers, 3 registers, 1 factual baseline. Burgess in the household. Mitford at the lunch table. The Talon note in the auction catalog. The factual baseline does not move. The interpretive register is what differs. The interesting witness for the historical through line is Nancy Mitford. Mitford was not a household staff figure. She was a diarist, a society writer, an observer at the kind of lunches the Queen Mother attended in the 1950s. Her record of one such lunch survives in her diary. The Queen Mother, Mitford wrote, had 2 dry martinis before, wine during, and port after, and everyone was exhausted trying to keep up with the consumption. That sentence was set down 4 decades before Burgess walked into Clarence House as the new equerry. The pattern Burgess observed in 1995, martini, wine, port, sometimes more, was the same pattern Mitford observed in the late 1950s. The brief's framing of 50 years of identical routine is rhetorical hyperbole. What is documentable is that the same outline of a day, 15 years apart in observation, in 2 completely different sources, produces the same drinks in the same order. Whatever the daily trolley looked like at the specific minute it arrived, the practice was old. Then The daughter. Princess Margaret's drink was famous grouse whiskey, taken with a dash of water. Malvern water, specifically, was the household requirement, and friends visiting her were expected to lay it in before her arrival. A decanter of grouse stood on the drinks tray in her Clarence House apartment from the 1950s onward. She could detect a substituted brand and would refuse to drink it. The detail is in Scotch Whisky Magazine's catalogue of famous whiskey drinkers. It is in the standard reference works on Margaret. It is in Tina Brown's Ma'am Darling, the 99 glimpses of Princess Margaret that Brown published in 2017, and that has become the second most cited source on Margaret's private life after the Christopher Warwick biography. Brown documented also in that same book the matchbox tumbler. Margaret had tried to combine smoking and drinking by gluing matchboxes to tumblers, so she could strike a match against the glass without setting down the drink. The image survives because it suggests the architecture of the underlying habit. 2 activities, 1 hand, no interruption. The mother and the daughter both lived, weekends, at Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, the country house George IV had once built and Queen Elizabeth had occupied as her own from the 1930s. The daughter had her own quarters there. They overlapped regularly. Whether they had a specific name for the joint evening, in the sense the audience has speculated they did, the documented record does not establish. What the documented record establishes is that Shawcross, the official biographer, with unrestricted access to the archive, set down that Margaret loved her mother, but was not always kind to her, and could be rude. That is a careful sentence in a careful biography. What it acknowledges, between the words, is 2 heavy drinkers in the same household, every weekend, for decades. The institutional management of all of this, the covering, the not saying. The Queen Mother went on a public engagement in the early 1990s, and as her aide carried her luggage off the royal flight, a hat box flew open at the bottom of the steps. A bottle of gin was inside. The story circulated. The Queen Mother's response, reproduced in Burgess's memoir, was the line that has become one of the more often quoted lines about her. "I couldn't get through all my engagements without a little something." The line is funny. It is also, by the standards of any other public figure of the period, an admission. She was carrying gin to engagements because the public day did not accommodate the noon Dubonnet. The household made arrangements. Hat boxes were used. Engagements were planned around the routine, not the other way round. That is the institutional management. When Burgess offered her, on one specific morning, a cup of tea, she replied. And the line is set down in the memoir, and it is the most often cited line in the published Burgess material. "I hadn't realized I enjoyed that reputation, but as I do, perhaps you could make it a large one." He made the gin. The tea was not made. There is another vignette in the same general territory. The Queen Mother had been told, by a member of her household concerned with the cellar accounts, that a Nebuchadnezzar of champagne, a 20-bottle bottle, the largest standard format produced by any French house, might go unconsumed across the holiday weeks at Royal Lodge. She replied, in a sentence later quoted in obituaries, "I'll polish it off myself." The Nebuchadnezzar, by the various household accounts, was polished off. There is, in this set of vignettes, a deliberate self-presentation, a woman who knew the audience for her wit and who used it. The drinking jokes were not denials. The drinking jokes were the way the routine was kept inside the household idiom rather than allowed to become a press question. These vignettes Burgess reproduces are funny in the same way many things that involve gin and royalty are funny. They are also, in aggregate, an inventory. The household functioned around the routine. The aides knew, the pages knew. Backstairs Billy, who held the note in his fingertips, knew. The royal flight knew. The auctioneers at Sotheby's in 2008 knew well enough to mark the Dubonnet note as the lot of the day. The under-butlers and the years and the houses kept the trolleys stocked. The kitchens kept the ice. The pages kept the schedules. The detective branch of the Metropolitan Police, which provided her personal protection, knew. None of them spoke publicly until the memoirs began. The household phrasing that circulates in the audience now, the form of words that emerges in the comment threads, the suggestion that on certain afternoons she was said to be resting, has no single primary citation that the searched record returns. But it has the rhythm of something that did get said, in the houses, by people who could not say it on the record. There was no audit of the cellar published in the Royal Trustees' reports. There was no formal staff briefing entered into a record. There was, in the sense the brief reaches for, no institutional acknowledgement. There was a household that functioned, and there was an outside world that did not. For 50 years, see the Trolley. The crises came and went under that routine. In 1955, Princess Margaret was attempting to obtain the institutional permission to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced equerry from her father's household. Townsend had been a fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain. He had served as equerry to George VI from 1944 onward. He had been divorced in 1952 on the grounds of his wife's adultery, which was, in the language of the church at the time, the innocent party divorce. The divorce that, under the prevailing reading, did not bar remarriage. The Queen Mother is documented by Pimlott, by Shawcross, by the standard Townsend literature, as offering Margaret no support. The household line at the time, attributed to the Queen Mother, was that Townsend was unsuitable. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, took the institutional line that a remarriage during the lifetime of a former spouse was incompatible with Margaret's position. Margaret eventually gave up the engagement and issued the famous statement of October 31st, 1955, that mindful of the Church's teachings, mindful of her duty to the Commonwealth, she had resolved not to marry. The Queen Mother's hand in the decision is documented. Whether the noon Dubonnet or the magic hour martini shaped any specific exchange between mother and daughter during those weeks of late 1955, the record does not say. The routine ran in the background. The decision is in the foreground. The brief asked the question. The documented record does not give the answer. The Queen Mother was 55 years old that month. She had been a widow for 3 years and 8 months. The cellar was already what it would be. In the mid-1970s, Margaret began an extended affair with Roderick Llewellyn, a young landscape gardener 17 years her junior. Much of it played out at the Moustique Villa Colin Tennant, later Lord Glenconner, had built for her on the island in the 1960s. The press photographs of 1976 of Margaret on the Moustique beach with Llewellyn were what finally brought the Snowdon marriage to public crisis. The Queen Mother was, by the household accounts then circulating and by the later biographies, on Margaret's side in domestic terms, but disengaged from the public image management of it. The marriage to Snowdon ended in formal separation in 1976 and in divorce in 1978, the first divorce in the senior royal family since Henry VIII. The routine, at Royal Lodge weekends, did not change. The famous grouse decanter did not move from Margaret's drinks tray. The noon Dubonnet did not move from the Queen Mother's. Whatever the two women said to each other in the working weekends of 1976, neither set it down in any document the audience has seen. In November of 1995, the Princess of Wales gave the BBC interview to Martin Bashir that would become known as the Panorama interview. The Queen Mother watched it. The household around her watched it. The position she took in the weeks following was the position the household maintained until her death 7 years later. Diana was a problem, and Diana's name, in her presence, would not be spoken. Burgess records the policy in his memoir. Letters from Diana to the Queen Mother, in the period after the interview, were dealt with by household staff and not by the Queen Mother herself. The standard biographies record the moment. whether the routine made the position rigid, or whether the position would have hardened anyway in a woman of 95 years and 3 months who had buried her husband 43 years earlier and her own institutional standing into the structure of the daughter-in-law's marriage, the record does not establish. What it establishes is that the Queen Mother held 3 institutional positions across 40 years, at the level of personal exclusion: Townsend in 55, Snowdon in 76, Diana in 95, and that the routine, the cellar, the household functioning were the constant under all 3. The last years. In January of 1998, at the age of 97, the Queen Mother was admitted to hospital for a right hip replacement operation. The official medical bulletin announced the procedure. The unofficial record was different. Pippa Penny, sommelier to the royal family, disclosed on the Channel 5 documentary Secret of the Royals that the Queen Mother had smuggled 12 bottles of Krug champagne into the hospital to make her stay more enjoyable. The bottles were valued at over $2,300. They were Krug, not the Veuve Clicquot pink she normally took at dinner. Krug, which was a step up. The procedure was successful. She was back at Clarence House within weeks. The bottles, presumably, did not survive the stay. Later in 1998, she fell at the Sandringham stables and required a left hip replacement. In 1995, she had had a cataract removed from the left eye. The body, after 9 decades, was failing. The routine did not change. The trolley did not change. The household did not change. Princess Margaret died on the 9th of February 2002, at age 71, of a stroke. The Queen Mother, by then 101 and herself extremely frail, attended the funeral in a wheelchair. Days later, she took a fall at Royal Lodge from which she did not recover. She died on the 30th of March 2002 at Royal Lodge, aged 101 years and 238 days, less than 7 weeks after burying her younger daughter. She lay in state for 3 days at Westminster Hall. Approximately 200,000 people queued past her coffin. The queue management operation was codenamed Operation Feather. The Telegraph and The Guardian, in their obituary coverage, used the words devoted, dutiful, beloved. They did not use the words Dubonnet, martini, port, Krug, hatbox, coots, overdraft, drinking club. The obituary register of 2002 was not the register the audience would be writing in 2026 in the comment thread under a YouTube video. What changed between 2002 and now was that the household memoirs began to publish. Burgess in 2006, Lady Colin Campbell in 2012, Tinniswood in 2018. The Talon note went under the hammer in 2008. The fragments accumulated. The trolley acquired a documented schedule. The hatbox acquired a quote. The magic hour acquired a verbatim asking voice. The audience, in 2026, looking at the same woman the obituaries had given them in 2002, has more information than the obituarists did, and most of that information has come from people who knew her or worked for her, or were paid by her. That is the gap between what the audience knows now and what the public knew in 1990. The Cecil Beaton phrase, in its harder form, was that she was a marshmallow made on a welding machine. The press took the softer version of that, a marshmallow made of steel, and ran with it for 50 years. The marshmallow got rather more coverage than the welding machine. The trolley, the noon gin, the magic hour martini, the Veuve Clicquot, the Coots overdraft, the 70 units a week, the welding machine, was the working part of the operation. The marshmallow was the surface. Both were in the room. Both are in the record now, if the record is read end to end. The trolley came at 10 minutes to 11 every morning of every year for 50 years. The bottles changed. Gordon's gave way to Bombay Sapphire in the late 1980s. The Dubonnet held its position throughout, but the Trolley did not. Major Burgess set down what he had seen. Lady Colin Campbell set down what she had been told. Cecil Beaton set down what he had inferred. Robert Lacey set down what he could prove. Anne Donna, in a comment on a video on YouTube in 2026, set down what her own mother had told her about being a guard outside Windsor Castle in 1964. 408 people clicked like. The Queen Mother died at 101. The marshmallow held to the last drink.